All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Cody Zimmerman, and this is my discussion for Who Runs the Church. I'm going to be talking to you all today about plural eldership. This is for Systematic Theology 2 for Urshan Graduate School of Theology for the spring 2018 semester. Quick disclaimer before I get into this video too far that the views and opinions of this video do not entirely capture the views of the presenter or any of his affiliated organizations. If any of your symptoms persist, please contact myself for further discussion, or you can speak to one of our wonderful professors or guest lecturers for further treatment and prayer. All right, so when we're talking about plural eldership, we have to look at who is using it and why it's being used. Now, historically, plural eldership is seen as a advent coming into the Reformation area, the Puritan church government. And there's actually very little, or a limited amount rather, of recent academic work on the specific topic of plural eldership. In fact, when I researched this through several academic databases, I didn't really get back any good articles or book recommendations even for plural eldership itself. However, spreading my search out a little bit more to Google and some other more non-academic sources, there is a variable plethora of different articles of various degrees of authenticity to support or discredit plural eldership. So we can see plural leadership in many denominations throughout the Christian faith today. We can look at the historical implications for reasons for why plural eldership makes the most sense today, as it has developed for most of us today as just a ethical form of leadership. And so when we look at why we use plural eldership, we're looking at biblical examples is what most of the strongest evidence for plural eldership is based upon. And in short, and I'll get into this a little bit more later when I get to some more specific biblical references, but no church in the New Testament had only one elder. And plural eldership simply helps to mitigate corruption, at the same time provides a system that many people feel comfortable with. So the biggest difference in this from the apostolic first century church to the modern church environment is just simply the governance associated with the church and the church's existence. Now, when you look at the separation of church and state that we have today, that is a completely foreign and, in fact, alien concept to people in early Christianity up until depending on who you're talking to, somewhere into the 4th century, with Christianity being a recognized religion in Rome. And then that caused the separation of church and state. That is what many scholars consider the first scenes of separation of church and state is by some of the decrees that was issued by some of the early descendants of Constantine. So plural eldership exists on a spectrum. Now this is true within many facets of government's existence, but when you look at the plural eldership, you see on one end of this a strict two-office view that focuses on elders and deacons, and that's it. Those two positions, and you don't vary from those. You don't add to, you don't take away. Even though, if need be, elder is not always necessarily a elder is always necessary, but a deacon is not always necessary if there's no one qualified to fill that role. And that's something uniform across almost all of authentic plural eldership. Now, on the other end of this spectrum, you see a three-office approach. Now, with this three-office approach, you still have the office of elders and deacons, but what you add is a teaching elder or a pastor. That would be seen as someone that would pretty much a tiebreaker vote. And this is something that has become popularized by many churches that utilize plural eldership in recent decades, just due to the shift of the common church existence and the way that people interact with each other, that there's often a senior pastor that's going to end up casting the vote anyway, even if you give them the title of elder or not. Naturally, you're going to fall into that. So that's why the three office approach is something that exists and for the most part is accepted across different church denominations that utilize plural eldership. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier as to when plural eldership started, you can see that church governance has changed and has modified and moves from era to era based on not only the local society and governance that it exists in, the civil society, but also just in who's in power at the time. And so it's hard to put an exact date or reference for a start of plural eldership, especially when you have the biblical evidence of its utilization in the New Testament. And then you see as the Catholic Church started to develop, you see a departure from plural eldership when you have additional roles and rules that are developed. And then when you get into the Protestant Reformation, you see a move back to the needs and the biblical structure of plural eldership. And it's important to note here that when you look at the early apostolic fathers, that in early church documents, there's no single mention of a supreme bishop or what came to be known as the office of the Pope. And so what does this really mean? It gets broken down into 4 principles as to what can define plural eldership. You have the Puritan branch, which in just very brief summary can be traced back to scripture with Deuteronomy 12:32. Whatever I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add nor take away from it. So with this idea, you see that God has a regulatory government for the church with the establishment of elders and deacons, and that we shouldn't add to and we shouldn't take away from that position. So when you start adding bishops and elders and different levels of eldership is when you start to depart from that scriptural presence. Also, they have an independent mindset with the independent local churches. Now, this doesn't mean that there is no universal church government, but we have an ideal that each local church has been given sufficient authority to order its worship and discipline. So while you have a church in an area that will act in a certain way, for example, if you have a church in a very rural section of Kentucky, close to where I happen to be, it's going to exist and operate in ways different from a church that might be in a more populated or urban area, somewhere in California or New York perhaps, just because of the population and the civil resources that you have available for the church to utilize. Democrat, and this is something that is a term that our author kind of kicks around with, and I too agree that it's kind of a hard, it's an interesting word to throw in here, but it's the best word for this principle. It's the ability for the body to elect and remove leadership. And I'm going to put extra emphasis on the fact that the removal of leadership is being more important than the election of leadership. When you look into scripture and other examples of a elder, a bishop being above reproach, that if somebody gets elected into that position, it is not a lifetime election. That's something that is critical for plural eldership to get across. And then you also have the final pillar here is plural elder principles, which looks back that more than one elder, and this can refer back to the spectrum that is mentioned earlier, when you look at pretty much just simply to put that there's more than one elder. So moving on from that. Scriptures for reference that really stick out and help to make the point for plural eldership. And I'm just going to read two of these and complete this quickly because I think it really helps get the point across for what I'm trying to argue. And then I might reference a couple of these other examples very quickly. But Acts 14 and 23. And when they had ordained them elders in every church and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord on whom they believed. And then the other scripture here that I'm going to reference quickly is Titus 1:5. For this cause left I thee in Crete, that thou shouldest set in order the things that are waiting, and ordain elders in every city as I had appointed thee. Now the main thing that I want to draw out from this is that in both of these scriptures, elders is pluralized. And then also you're looking at different cities and different areas. And so that's not just in one situation. And then you see through the book of Acts several variations in chapters 11, and then also several times throughout chapter 15 and then chapter 16 as well. And almost every example of elders in these references are pluralized, as well as several other references through Acts 20 and 21. And then the book of Timothy and 1 Timothy and Titus, as I had already quoted. So when we look at these and how it affects the ability for church governments to affect and actually work in the modern era, there are going to be changes from the biblical text, and we see that advent of the additional elder that's added on later in time. But with that, you see that they are still going to work with the ideal of it's going to be more than one elder, and in an ideal situation, you're going to have multiple deacons to support and help those elders. So I hope that this has been helpful and beneficial to you all, and has helped to clarify the existence of plural eldership and its utilization in church governments. Thank you all very much for your time. Have a blessed day.